So I proposed in the newspaper to not call it a cut or a knip in Dutch, but to call it a stitch or a hechting. Because what we're doing is we're stitching the urban tissue that once was cut by road. Right? And this small change of talking about we're stitching the urban tissue will also lead you to think about different things to measure. It will also change the debate.
We know we have to transition to a mobility in cities where cars have a much less central role for all sorts of reasons, really a big diversity of reasons. It's not just climate change.
And at the Weesperstraat, what they tried to do is to figure out what happens if you radically close the street for car traffic and open it up for people. So this is quite a busy street in the middle of Amsterdam. So what they tried to learn and measure was what does this do with car traffic specifically. The Weesperstraat, as we know it, as a sewage for cars, is also an experiment that started in the 1960s. Before that, it was actually the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam, a neighborhood with very dense urban tissue. So what tends to happen if you propose a radical change to something is that the people that lose something, in this case the taxi drivers or the people that drive a car on the Weesperstraat, become very active, very loud, and often very toxic.
The city of Ghent, to use an example, is much smaller than Amsterdam. They have tens of these experiments every summer for 10 years already. So, and there's nothing. Yeah, I mean, it's not such a big thing. I think what we learn from other cities in Europe and elsewhere is to see these kind of experiments more as normal things, not part of transforming cities and mobility.
We want to radically change the status quo. You will always have people that defend that status quo. It's normal, I would say even. We've seen that in all the big changes over history. How can you empower those that are currently suffering in the status quo? For instance, in the city, children that can no longer play outside by themselves. They are not heard in this discussion.
Very often these experiments make people discover who their neighbors are. Sometimes people talk for the first time to somebody they lived next to for years, but because the street was not a place to be, they never had that opportunity. So that's on the positive side. But on the negative side, which is just as important because you want to learn on both sides, for instance, that some people really depend on the car to access very essential things. And maybe even just the fact that parking has become difficult or impossible means that for an old person that their children that live in the suburbs don't visit anymore or less.
So everybody talks about those people that are suffering from closing the street instead of opening a street or stitching a neighborhood. And that has to do with the narrative and the conversation and the toxic conversation you get on social media and in the media.
In the end, is an opportunity to have a dialogue in a way that you can never have just around a table or just in simulation. You have to experience it. But then it has to be an experience that is shared, is a real conversation.